They all think I am losing my mind. I see it in the way they tilt their heads when I speak, the way they nod too quickly, as if agreeing with a confused child. My son calls me forgetful. My daughter-in-law pats my hand as though I were a piece of delicate glass, about to shatter with the next breath. What they don't understand is that I have lived long enough to recognize the shape of greed. It has a smell, a weight in the room, a way of turning smiles into thin masks. I sit in my chair by the window every morning with my coffee, pretending to stare at the birds. I do love them, yes, but I also listen. Walls in this old house carry more secrets than any of them realize, and lately, those walls have been whispering words that chill me more than the December wind outside. Words like estate, transfer, signatures. Last week, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice in the kitchen. She thought I was asleep. She said, "She doesn't even know where half her papers are. We can handle this before she notices." My son grunted in reply, his tone heavy with impatience. He said, "Just let her think it's still hers. By the time she figures it out, it'll be done." I pressed my hand to my chest as if to calm my heart, though it wasn't fear that beat there. It was fury. They believe I'm too old to understand, too old to notice what's mine being measured and divided while I'm still breathing. They've mistaken my silence for weakness. I raised those children with my bare hands. My husband and I built this home, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. He used to say that the walls of this house carried our laughter, our struggles, and our love. To imagine them taking it all, tearing away the last piece of him I have left, it's like being buried alive. I didn't confront them. Not then. I smiled when they came into the living room, feigning innocence. I asked about dinner, about the weather, about things old women are supposed to fuss over. Inside, I began planning. I told myself, if they think I'm blind, then let me be their shadow. Let them speak freely, thinking I am too frail to matter. Every word they drop is a stone, and I am building my own wall out of them. They don't know the fire that lives in me still. They don't remember the nights I worked double shifts, the mornings I walked miles in the snow to put food on the table. Age has not softened me. It has only sharpened my resolve. So let them laugh behind closed doors. Let them whisper over paperwork. They will soon learn that I am not too old to understand. I am old enough to know exactly when to strike. The first real crack appeared on a Sunday afternoon, during what was supposed to be a family meal. I watched them bustle around my kitchen like it was already theirs. My daughter-in-law carried herself with the self-importance of a queen, pulling out my serving platters as though she had bought them herself. My son barely looked at me. He was too busy checking his phone, his thumbs moving fast, while his mouth stretched into little smirks. I sat at the head of the table, as I always have, but I could feel how they resented that. The seat had been my place since the first Thanksgiving in this house. My husband carved the turkey, and I passed the potatoes. We raised our glasses to hard work, to family, to survival. That chair still holds his shape in my memory. Now my son sits across from me with eyes that won't meet mine. Halfway through the meal, I heard the shift. My daughter-in-law asked him if he had spoken with the lawyer yet. Her voice was too casual, like someone commenting on the weather. He shook his head and said, "Not yet, but soon." She lowered her voice then, though not enough for me to miss it. She said, "We need to move before she forgets again." I placed my fork down quietly. My grandson was beside me, playing with his mashed potatoes, and I forced myself to smile at him. But inside, something snapped. Forget again. As if a lifetime of memories, of choices, of survival, could be dismissed with a single word. Forget. They think I am fading, like an old photograph left in the sun. After the meal, I lingered in the hallway and listened. My son's voice was sharp now. He said, "If we wait too long, the house might end up tied up in probate. She's not going to live forever." I wanted to step into the kitchen right then, to slam my hand down on the counter and remind them whose roof they stood under. But I didn't. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Because that is the thing about war. You don't rush into the first skirmish. You wait. You let the enemy believe you are weak. You let them underestimate you until the ground beneath their feet is no longer theirs. That night, alone in my room, I pulled out the box where I keep all my papers. My husband's handwriting on old mortgage slips, my name carefully signed on insurance forms, letters yellowed with time. I ran my fingers across them like a soldier counting weapons. They thought I didn't know where my documents were, but I know. I have always known. And I promised myself as I slid the box back under my bed. They will never see me coming. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the old house breathe. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the chimney carried me back to the years when this home was still alive with noise. The sound of little feet running down the hall, the slam of the screen door in summer, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. I raised my children here, every corner of this place tied to a piece of me I will never get back. I remember when my son was small, before his eyes learned the art of calculation. He used to bring me dandelions, yellow fists of sunshine clutched in his dirty hands, declaring that he would always take care of me. I believed him. We all believe our children when they promise to love us forever. But forever, I've learned, has an expiration date once money enters the room. When my daughter was born, my husband and I stayed up nights worrying if we could afford diapers. We worked shifts that overlapped like jagged puzzle pieces, sometimes barely seeing each other for days. But we kept the lights on, and we paid off this house brick by brick. My husband used to say, "One day this house will keep them safe, even when we're gone." I think about that often now, how he trusted that blood would mean loyalty, and how wrong he might have been. I look at my children now and wonder where I failed. Did I spoil them too much? Did I make survival look too easy? They see the walls and furniture, but not the years carved into them. They see property, not history. They see inheritance, not sacrifice. As I lay awake, I asked myself if maybe I was imagining things. Maybe grief was twisting my thoughts. But then I remembered the look on my daughter-in-law's face when she touched my china cabinet that evening. Her fingers brushed the glass like she was already deciding what would go where in her new dining room. It wasn't kindness. It was possession. The ache in my chest wasn't just anger. It was disappointment, deep and raw. I had spent decades building something meant to hold us together. Instead, it was pulling us apart. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and reached for the notebook I keep by my bed. I wrote down everything I'd overheard, every detail, every word. If my memory was the thing they wanted to question, then I would put it all in ink. They wanted to paint me as confused, as forgetful. Fine. I would give them proof that I was more awake than they could imagine. As I closed the notebook, I whispered into the quiet house, "They'll learn. They'll learn soon enough." The next morning, my daughter-in-law arrived earlier than usual. She breezed into the house carrying a paper bag with muffins from the bakery down the street, her smile wide and rehearsed. She set the bag down in front of me and said, "I thought you might like a treat. You don't get out much these days." Her tone dripped with sweetness, but I heard the grit underneath. I thanked her politely, because that is what women of my generation were trained to do. But inside, I studied her the way a hawk studies a rabbit. Every movement of hers seemed just a little too careful. She fussed with the curtains, straightened my magazines, poured my coffee without asking. She wasn't helping me. She was rehearsing for the role she wanted, the lady of this house. As she sat across from me, she leaned forward and asked if I had found all the paperwork for my insurance. She said it lightly, like she was concerned, but her eyes never left my face. I told her I had everything in order, and I smiled while I said it. Her lips twitched just for a second before she recovered and told me how lucky I was to have family around me. Lucky. That word felt like an insult. I was lucky when my husband survived a car accident in his 40s. I was lucky when our mortgage was finally paid off after 35 years. I was lucky when my son was accepted into college on a scholarship. But this, sitting across from a woman who sees me as an obstacle instead of a mother, that is not luck. That is betrayal dressed in perfume. She talked about how hard it was raising children these days, how expensive everything was, how she and my son had been worrying about the future. I listened and nodded at all the right places, pretending to be the frail, sympathetic grandmother she wanted me to be. But her words were arrows aimed at the same target: my house, my savings, my security. At one point, she reached over and patted my hand. She said, "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, that everything is simple and clear when the time comes." The time comes. She spoke as if I were already halfway in the grave, as if my chair by the window were just a waiting room for death. I excused myself and walked slowly to my bedroom, letting my joints creak like an old door, exaggerating my limp. I wanted her to believe in the mask she had painted for me, weak, distracted, fading. Behind the closed door, I pressed my back against the wood and let out a low laugh. She thought she was clever. She thought I was blind. But I had been a wife, a mother, a worker, a survivor. I knew how to read lies. And I decided then, if she wanted a performance, I would give her one. It happened 2 weeks later, on a damp Thursday morning. I was dusting the shelves in the living room, moving slower than usual so that anyone watching would think I was just a tired old woman keeping herself busy. But as I bent to straighten a stack of magazines, a thin manila folder slipped out from the bottom and landed at my feet. I almost ignored it, assuming it was one of my old recipe clippings. But when I picked it up, I saw my name typed neatly across the front. My pulse quickened. I carried it to my chair, set my glasses firmly on my nose, and opened it. Inside were documents I had never signed, forms with my name printed, spaces left for my signature. They spoke of transfer of property, simplified estate planning, joint ownership. My eyes lingered on the phrase, "in the event of incapacitation." My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from rage. Someone had been planting these papers in my house, waiting for the right moment to slip them in front of me with a pen. Maybe during one of those coffee chats, when they thought I was half asleep. Maybe during a holiday, when the air was thick with distraction. I heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly tucked the folder under a cushion. My son appeared in the doorway, asking if I needed anything from the store. His voice was casual, too casual, like he was rehearsing lines from a script. I smiled and said, "Just milk and bread, thank you." He nodded and left. But as I watched him walk away, I saw the faintest smirk tug at his mouth. After he was gone, I pulled the folder out again. I read every page, every clause, every date. My eyesight may blur on fine print, but my mind is sharper than ever. They were trying to make me sign away the only thing that tied me to my husband, to my past, to my dignity. They thought I would stumble into it blindly, grateful for their help. That night, I sat at my desk with a lamp casting a circle of light on the papers. I copied down phrases into my notebook, my pen scratching like a soldier's knife sharpening on stone. I wanted proof, my own record, something they couldn't twist. And then, as the clock struck midnight, I closed the folder, tucked it back where I had found it, and whispered to myself, I will not be the fool in their story. They want to treat me as a relic, something to be boxed and stored away. But I have lived too long, worked too hard, and buried too many dreams to let them bury me alive. That night, I slept soundly, my hand resting on the notebook. They thought they had planted a trap. What they didn't realize was that they had handed me the very weapon I needed. People like to think that age makes you soft, that the years dull your senses until you are nothing but a shadow, waiting for the end. I hear it in their voices, the way they slow their words for me, as if my ears no longer understand English. I see it in the way clerks at the pharmacy look past me to the younger woman behind me in line. To them, I am invisible, a relic, a burden. But they don't understand the kind of strength time gives you. Wrinkles are just scars from battles survived. Every crease around my mouth is a year I didn't give up, a season I pushed through when the world said I couldn't. My bones may ache in the morning, but my mind is sharper than it has ever been. I don't waste time on illusions anymore. I see people for who they are, stripped of their polite masks. When my son calls me forgetful, what he really means is that he hopes I am. Forgetful enough not to notice the missing papers, the hushed conversations, the sudden kindness that feels more like surveillance. Forgetful enough to sign my name without asking why. But I remember. I remember more than he could imagine. I remember the hunger in the early years of marriage, when my husband and I shared one coat between us. I remember the shame of standing in line at the bank, praying our check wouldn't bounce. I remember working 2 jobs and coming home so tired that I'd fall asleep sitting up in this very chair. Those years taught me to keep my eyes open, to count every penny, to listen between words. You don't forget skills like that. They live in your blood. And I remember promises. My husband swore to me on the night we signed the last mortgage payment that this house would always be mine. He said, no matter what happens, you'll never be without a home. His voice was steady, certain, the way only a man who has bled for something can sound. That promise is stitched into these walls, and I will not let anyone tear it out. So when they call me fragile, I smile. Let them. It is my disguise. They see frailty where there is only calculation. They see weakness where there is strategy. If they want to underestimate me, then I will use their blindness as my cloak. I know what they are planning, and I know how to stop it. Age has given me many gifts, but the greatest of them all is patience. And patience, in the hands of someone who has nothing left to fear, is more dangerous than any weapon. I woke up before dawn, the house still cloaked in silence. My son and his wife wouldn't be by until the afternoon, and that gave me just enough time. I put on my thick coat, the one with the deep pockets, and slipped my notebook inside. The air was sharp with frost when I stepped outside, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of moving under my own power. The bus stop was nearly empty. A young man glanced at me, then quickly returned to his phone. To him, I was just another old woman shuffling to an appointment. That was fine. The less attention I drew, the better. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard slowly, letting my joints creak. But inside I was alert, counting the stops, rehearsing what I would say. The law office was a modest brick building downtown, the kind of place you'd pass without noticing. I had chosen it deliberately. No gleaming skyscrapers, no flashy advertisements, just a brass plaque with the name Harrison Weller. I had seen their ad in the back of the local paper, small and unassuming, but something about it had struck me as trustworthy. Inside, the receptionist looked up, startled, then smiled warmly. I told her I needed to speak to someone about my will. The words felt heavy in my mouth, but also powerful. I wasn't here to be led into a trap. I was here to build my shield. They ushered me into a small office lined with shelves of dusty books. Mr. Harris was a thin man with kind eyes and the posture of someone used to listening more than speaking. He asked me gently what had brought me in. I told him everything. The overheard conversations, the planted documents, the way my son's wife circled me like a vulture. As I spoke, I saw his expression harden, not with judgment, but with resolve. He asked if I had any proof. I slid my notebook across the desk, pages filled with my handwriting, dates, and snippets of dialogue. His eyebrows lifted as he read. Then he nodded and said, "You're not nearly as defenseless as they think." We spent hours discussing options. He explained what could be done, how I could rewrite my will in a way that no one could tamper with, how safeguards could be put in place. I listened, every word carving away the fear that had been weighing me down. When I left the office, papers tucked securely in my bag, I felt lighter than I had in months. They thought I was a pawn, drifting toward the end of the board. But I had just learned how to move like a queen. On the bus ride home, I caught my reflection in the window. The face staring back at me was lined, weathered, tired. But the eyes, they burned. Dinner that Sunday carried a weight I could feel before anyone even sat down. The table was set with my old china, the good plates I once saved for holidays. My daughter-in-law insisted we should use them more often, saying life was too short to keep nice things hidden in cupboards. I could hear the irony in her voice. She wasn't thinking of short lives in general. She was thinking of mine. I sat at the head of the table as always, but it felt like a throne under siege. My son passed dishes around with mechanical politeness, his eyes darting everywhere but toward mine. My daughter-in-law smiled too brightly, complimenting the roast as though she had cooked it herself. My grandchildren picked at their food, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Children can always feel when love has curdled, even if they don't yet know the taste of betrayal. Halfway through the meal, she started her performance. She spoke about a friend's mother who had recently been moved into assisted living. She said, "It's such a relief when the family can take care of everything in advance, before things get complicated." She turned her head toward me, her eyes wide with false sympathy. It was less a story and more a message wrapped in silk. My son chimed in, his tone practical, almost cold. He said, "It's always best to simplify things now before it's too late." He looked at me then, finally, and in his gaze I saw not the boy who once ran to me with dandelions in his fist, but a man calculating timelines and signatures. I set down my fork and folded my hands in my lap. I kept my voice calm, even gentle when I asked, "Too late for what?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke for a long moment. My daughter-in-law broke the silence with a laugh too sharp, too thin. She said, "Oh, just before things get confusing with all the legal stuff, we only want what's best for you, best for me." That phrase rolled around in my head like a bitter pill. Best for me meant best for them. Best for me meant erasing my will, my choices, my history, so they could feast on what was left. I smiled, as though reassured, and said I would think about it. Their shoulders relaxed, convinced they had planted the seed. But inside, I was already imagining the look on their faces when they discovered what I had done. The rest of the meal passed in strained politeness. I laughed when they laughed, nodded when they spoke. but every bite I swallowed felt like iron. I wasn't eating dinner. I was swallowing my anger whole, saving it for the day it would finally serve me. That night, after the table was cleared and the dishes stacked, I sat alone in the quiet house. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each second pressing on me like a reminder. I thought of him, my husband, my partner, my anchor. His presence lingered in every corner, though he had been gone for years. I closed my eyes and remembered the way he used to come home from long shifts at the factory, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but still finding the strength to kiss me on the forehead and ask how my day had been. He carried the weight of our family on his back, never complaining, always moving forward. We built this house not just with money, but with sweat and sacrifice. Every board, every nail, every late-night argument over bills, it was all part of our story. I could still hear his voice the day we signed the final mortgage payment. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one my son now leans across to discuss simplifying things. My husband had smiled, weary but proud, and said, "This is ours, forever. No matter what happens, you'll always have this roof." That was his promise to me, a vow carved into stone. I wonder what he would think now, watching his son circle me like a predator, watching the woman who married into this family the cabinets as if they were already hers. Would his heart break the way mine does? Or would he be too angry to feel anything at all? Sometimes, late at night, I talked to him as if he were still beside me. I told him about the folder I found, about the conversations I overheard. I whispered, "They think I'm too old to fight, but they've forgotten who I am." And in the silence that followed, I could almost hear him chuckle the way he used to when someone underestimated me. He'd always said I had more grit than most men he'd known. The house seemed to listen too. The walls that once echoed with children's laughter now carried my whispered vows. I ran my hand along the wooden banister, smooth from years of palms sliding over it, and I felt him there. I felt his strength, his stubbornness. "I will not let them take this from me," I said softly. "Not from me, and not from you." When I finally went to bed, I placed my husband's old photograph on the nightstand beside me. His smile was frozen in time, but his eyes still carried that steady determination. I let them guide me into sleep. They may believe I am alone, but I am not. Every promise he ever made to me still lives here, and I intend to keep them. It happened on a Tuesday, as ordinary a day as any. I was sitting by the window with my knitting when my son arrived unannounced. He didn't come alone. My daughter-in-law followed, carrying her oversized purse like it was a briefcase. The air around them was charged, rehearsed. I knew before they even opened their mouths that this was the moment. My son sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His voice was steady, too steady. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about some important things." The way he said important made my skin prickle. I set my knitting aside and nodded, pretending calm. My daughter-in-law slid a folder from her purse, the same color as the one I had found weeks ago. She placed it gently on the coffee table, as if it were a gift instead of a blade. She said, "We've been worried about you. You're handling so much on your own, and it would give us peace of mind to help." Help. I almost laughed, but I kept my lips pressed into a thin smile. My son cleared his throat. He said, "This is just a simple document. It makes things easier for all of us, you included. It ensures the house is in safe hands, that there won't be complications later." He avoided my eyes as he spoke, fixing his gaze on the folder. I asked, "Safe hands?" "Whose hands?" My voice was mild, but my question landed like a stone. There was a pause. My daughter-in-law smoothed her skirt, her mouth twitching into that same smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. She said, "We'd be the joint owners. That way, if anything happens," I cut her off. "If anything happens to me, you mean?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice. My son's jaw tightened. He said, "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're just trying to protect you. Protect me." As if I were a child about to run into traffic. As if I hadn't protected them my entire life. Through illness, through hunger, through every storm that threatened to break us. I placed my hand on the folder, but I didn't open it. I looked him in the eyes, steady and unflinching. I said, "I'll think about it." Relief washed over their faces, like they believed the battle was already won. My daughter-in-law reached for my hand, squeezing it softly, as though sealing the deal. But I squeezed back just a little harder, and she flinched. When they left, I sat in the quiet, staring at the folder they had left behind. They thought I was cornered. They thought they had me. But they didn't know I had already made my move. For the next few weeks, I played my part. I let them think I was leaning toward their plan, letting their words sink in, letting their smiles convince me. I nodded when my son reminded me how complicated probate court could be. I sighed when my daughter-in-law mentioned horror stories about families torn apart by messy estates. I even touched the folder once or twice, as though I were curious, as though the thought of signing had begun to soften me. They were so eager to believe. Every time I hesitated, they filled the silence with reassurances, painting themselves as selfless protectors. My son would pat my shoulder and say, "We just want you to be comfortable, Mom." Comfortable, like a body tucked neatly into a coffin. My daughter-in-law would bring over baked goods, tea, little tokens of love. She fussed over me like a nurse rehearsing for her role. I let them. I let them hover, let them smile, let them think they had me wrapped in their careful net. But inside, I was steel. My lawyer and I had already met again. The new will was drawn, signed, witnessed, and tucked away where no greedy hand would find it. My estate was protected, my wishes carved into stone sharper than any blade they thought they wielded. Every time I looked at the folder they left on the coffee table, I felt a dark kind of humor rise in me. It was like watching a child try to trick a magician with a card game. They had no idea the performance was already mine. One evening, they pressed harder. My son asked if I'd had the chance to go through the papers. His voice carried that mix of impatience and false patience, the tone of a man who thinks victory is just out of reach. I told him softly, "I'm not ready yet. I want to take my time." His wife chimed in, her voice dripping with syrup. "Of course, take all the time you need." But I caught the flicker in her eyes, the way her jaw tightened before she forced the smile back. She wanted me to sign before I slipped away, before time betrayed her ambition. I excused myself early that night, retreating to my bedroom. Behind the closed door, I laughed quietly, a laugh that felt like a secret weapon. Let them wait, let them circle. Every day they grew bolder, more careless, more certain of their hold. And every day they walked closer to the moment when their scheme would collapse around them. I may have looked like a frail old woman playing with yarn and recipes, but what I was really doing was weaving a net, and soon it would be their turn to feel trapped. It was the night I chose to take back everything they thought they'd stolen from me. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock in the hall. I set the lamp on my desk, its light spilling over the papers Mr. Harris had prepared. The new will, my will, lay there waiting for me like a weapon sheathed in plain white pages. I sat down slowly, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I thought of my husband, of his promise that this house would always be mine, that I would never be without shelter. I whispered his name into the room, as if to ask for his blessing. The shadows didn't answer, but I felt him there all the same. I picked up the pen, steadying it between my fingers. My name looked fragile at the top of the page, as though it belonged to someone fading, but when I signed, I pressed hard, letting the ink bite into the paper. Line after line, page after page, I carved my will into existence. I wasn't just signing a legal document, I was sealing my legacy, protecting everything I had bled and broken myself for. When it was done, I sat back and stared at the pages, the ink still drying. For a moment I thought I might cry, but the tears never came. What I felt wasn't sadness, it was power. They believed I was drifting into confusion, that my mind was slipping through cracks like sand. But here, tonight, every word was clear, every decision sharp. I had outmaneuvered them. I slipped the signed will into a thick envelope and tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand, beneath my husband's photograph. Tomorrow, it would be taken back to Mr. Harris for safekeeping. Tonight, it was mine alone. As I prepared for bed, I glanced at the folder my son and his wife had left on the coffee table. It sat there like bait, waiting for me to take it. I almost laughed out loud at the sight. They thought they were hunters, circling their prey. But I had already laid the trap, and soon they would step into it with their own eager feet. When I climbed into bed, the house seemed to exhale around me, the way a body does after holding its breath too long. I closed my eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in months. Let them come tomorrow, next week, next month with their papers and their sweet words. I was ready, because they thought I was too old to understand. And that night, I proved I understood everything. The morning after I signed the will, I woke earlier than usual. The envelope sat heavy in my nightstand, tucked beneath my husband's photograph, and I felt the weight of it like armor on my chest. Before breakfast, I slipped it into my bag and rode the bus back downtown, my breath clouding the glass as the city blurred past. When I handed it to Mr. Harris, his assistant stamped the date and locked it away in a safe. My secret was no longer fragile. It was protected by steel. When I returned home, the folder my son had left still sat on the coffee table. I hadn't touched it since that Tuesday. I let it gather dust deliberately, as though I were too tired or too careless to deal with it. Every time they visited, my daughter-in-law's eyes flicked toward it, her smile tightening. She wanted me to open it, to sign, to surrender. And every time, I leaned on my cane and said, "Not yet. Maybe tomorrow." I began to notice the little ways they grew confident. My son carried himself taller, more certain, as if the house already belonged to him. He inspected the gutters one afternoon, clucking his tongue like a landlord surveying his property. My daughter-in-law rearranged my kitchen drawers without asking, saying things would be easier this way. She even told me once that the old curtains made the room gloomy, suggesting we replace them. "We," she said, as if the word belonged to her. I nodded and smiled, playing the role they expected, the absent-minded matriarch too weary to resist. But inside I catalogued every gesture, every smug glance, every slip of the tongue. They weren't careful anymore. They thought victory was near, and arrogance is the sharpest blindfold. At night I returned to my notebook. I wrote down everything, each detail like a brick in the wall I was building. When the day came, I wanted no room for denial. I wanted their own actions to stand as witness against them. One evening, while they cleared the dinner table, I sat quietly and listened. My daughter-in-law whispered, "It's only a matter of time. She's slowing down more every day." My son replied, "Yeah, soon enough it'll all be ours." I pressed my lips together, steadying the fire in my chest. If only they knew. If only they realized the will they spoke of was already rewritten, signed, and sealed. I let them carry the dishes away, their laughter echoing in the kitchen. I sat in my chair, stroking the armrest polished by decades of hands, mine, my husband's, my children's when they were small. They thought they were stripping me of power, but really I was letting them walk deeper into my game. And when the curtain finally rose, they would find themselves on the wrong side of the stage. They chose a Sunday afternoon for their little ambush. I knew it the moment they asked to sit down as a family after lunch. My son carried the folder like a sacred text, tucked under his arm with an air of ceremony. My daughter-in-law hovered close, her hand brushing his sleeve, her smile wide but brittle. Even the grandchildren were sent outside to play, their laughter carried away by the wind while the house filled with a colder sound, silence sharpened with expectation. We sat in the living room, the three of us, the air thick as wet wool. My son set the folder on the coffee table and looked at me as though he were about to deliver a sermon. He said, "Mom, it's time." His tone was firm, no longer coated with patience. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a command. I folded my hands in my lap and tilted my head. "Time for what?" I asked, my voice soft enough to make him lean forward. His wife answered before he could. "Time to make things official. We can't keep putting this off." She pushed the folder toward me, her manicured fingers tapping the edge. She said, "We just need your signature, and everything will be simple." I glanced down at the folder, then back at her. The look on her face was a mix of hunger and triumph, as though she were already tasting victory. My son shifted in his seat, restless, impatient. He said, "This is for the best, Mom. You don't have to worry anymore." Worry. That word nearly made me laugh. I had been worrying for months, but not about myself, about them, about what greed does to the human soul, how it strips away every layer of decency until nothing is left but the bone. I let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. I reached out at last, my hand hovering above the folder, close enough to make them hold their breath. Then I pulled back and said, "Not today." Their faces fell in unison. My son tried to mask his frustration, but his jaw clenched. My daughter-in-law's smile cracked, sharp as broken glass. She said, "You don't understand. This is important." I looked her in the eye, steady and calm, and replied, "I understand perfectly. That was all." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. My son finally stood, muttering something about trying again later. They left in a flurry of forced politeness, but I saw the storm brewing in their eyes. When the door closed, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. They thought they had staged a grand unveiling, a moment where I would finally fold. Instead, I gave them nothing but a wall of silence, and sometimes silence is the sharpest blade of all. That night, when the house was mine again, I sat in the dark with only the clock for company. The silence I had used against them earlier now turned against me, pressing heavy on my chest. I thought of my son's face, the lines carved deeper by ambition than by age, and I wondered where I had gone wrong. Guilt crept in like a draft under the door. Had I raised him to believe that love could be measured in deeds or in dollars? Did I make life too easy when I should have let him taste struggle longer? I remembered the boy who once cried when he dropped his ice cream, and the teenager who swore he'd take care of me when I was old. That boy had long vanished, swallowed by a man who now saw me as a hurdle to be cleared. The anger rose, hot and sharp, pushing the guilt aside. Betrayal burns deeper than any wound because it comes from the hands you once trusted. My daughter-in-law's smile replayed in my mind, that brittle sweetness she wore like perfume. "She thinks she's clever," I muttered to the empty room, and the sound of my own voice startled me. I pressed my palms together, whispering a prayer I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Not for strength, I had plenty of that, but for clarity. Anger can blind as much as grief, and I couldn't afford blindness. This wasn't just about punishing them. It was about protecting what mattered. My husband's promise, my dignity, the roof I built with my own hands. Still, the guilt lingered. I thought of my grandchildren, too young to understand, caught in the middle of a storm they didn't create. I loved them more fiercely than anything, and I feared what would happen when the truth spilled into daylight. Would they turn from me? Would they grow up thinking their grandmother was cruel, stubborn, selfish? That fear sat heavy in my gut. But then I remembered the sight of my son pushing that folder across the table, the certainty in his voice when he told me it was time. And I knew, if I surrendered now, I wouldn't just lose the house. I'd lose myself. And once you give away your soul, there is no reclaiming it. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I had tended for decades. Even in the dark, I could make out the outlines of the roses my husband planted, the ones I still prune every spring. They were stubborn things, those roses, thorny but beautiful, surviving winter after winter. I whispered, "If they want to cut me down, they'll find I have thorns too." And with that, the guilt eased. What remained was resolve, sharp as steel. It was my grandson who gave me the first flicker of light in all that darkness. He came by one afternoon after school, his backpack slung low and his sneakers leaving little trails of mud across my kitchen floor. He didn't try to hide it. He never does. He's at that age where honesty still wins over pretense, and I find it refreshing in a house so heavy with lies. He asked if he could sit with me by the window, the spot where I drink my coffee, and pretend not to notice the world plotting against me. I nodded, and he plopped down with all the grace of a young boy, knees bumping against the wooden frame. For a while we just sat, watching a cardinal pick seeds from the feeder. Then he said, "Grandma, why are Mom and Dad always talking about papers?" I froze. He was too young to understand the sharpness of his own question, but it cut through me all the same. I asked gently, "What papers do you mean?" He shrugged, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I hear them in the kitchen. They say you forget things. They say they're helping you. But you don't forget things, do you?" I felt my throat tighten. Children notice more than adults give them credit for. I smiled at him, soft but steady, and said, "No, sweetheart. I don't forget the things that matter." He looked at me with those wide eyes, full of the same sincerity I once saw in his father when he was a boy. And in that gaze, I found something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. He told me he didn't like when they whispered about me. He said it made him feel like they were keeping secrets. I wanted to wrap him in my arms and promise him the world, but I knew better than to load his young shoulders with the weight of this battle. Instead, I brushed his hair back and told him sometimes grown-ups forget what's important, but that doesn't mean the truth disappears. When he left, my heart ached. Not from anger this time, but from the bittersweet reminder that love still lived inside this family, even if greed had strangled so much of it. That boy had given me something no lawyer, no document could: the reminder that my fight wasn't just for me. It was for the pieces of goodness still left, the ones worth protecting. As the door closed behind him, I whispered to the empty room, "Not all of them are lost." And for the first time in a long while, I felt less alone. Sunday came, and with it the ritual I have followed for decades. Church. I put on my navy dress, the one with the pearl buttons my husband always said made me look like I belonged on the cover of a hymn book. My son insisted on driving me, though it was less kindness and more surveillance. My daughter-in-law came too, of course, her perfume filling the car like a cloud meant to choke me. The church hadn't changed much in 50 years. Same wooden pews polished by generations of hands, same stained glass windows casting colored shadows across the floor. But the people, oh, the people had changed. They smiled, but their eyes were sharp, always measuring. Age makes you invisible until there's property at stake. Then suddenly, everyone sees you again. We sat together in the second row. I could feel the whispers brush against my back like gnats. A woman behind me murmured something about how lucky I was to have my son looking after me. Another said she'd heard I was slipping. Their voices weren't cruel exactly, but pity can cut deeper than cruelty. My daughter-in-law leaned close during the sermon, her breath sweet with peppermint. She whispered, "People here really admire how devoted we are to you." She said it with pride, as if my existence were a trophy she could polish in front of the congregation. I kept my eyes fixed on the pulpit, though the words of the pastor blurred together. My thoughts roared louder than any sermon. Devoted. That was the word she chose. Devoted like a vulture circling a carcass, praising itself for patience. When it came time for communion, I walked to the front on my own, cane steady in my hand. I could feel their eyes on me, searching for weakness, waiting for me to stumble. But I didn't stumble. I lifted my chin and took the bread and wine with a steady grip. In that moment, I wanted them to see strength, not frailty. After the service, as we stood in the fellowship hall sipping weak coffee, the pastor approached. He patted my hand and said, "Your family is a blessing." I smiled politely, but inside I thought, blessings don't plot to steal from you. Blessings don't wait for you to die so they can celebrate. I excused myself, walking slowly to the car while my son chatted with the deacons. My daughter-in-law caught up to me, her heels clicking on the pavement. She said, "You see how everyone respects us. They know we'll take good care of you." Her tone was warm, but I heard the victory she thought she already owned. I didn't answer. I just slid into the back seat, folding my hands in my lap. They wanted an image of a helpless widow clinging to her family. Fine, let them build that picture. It would only make the truth strike harder when the frame finally shattered. It was supposed to be a celebration. My granddaughter's birthday, balloons tied to the fence, tables spread with food, neighbors and relatives gathered in the yard. Children ran through the grass with frosting on their faces, their laughter ringing like bells. For a few moments I let myself breathe. Birthdays had always been my favorite, the one day when joy felt simple, untainted. But joy doesn't last long when greed sits at the table. I was seated at the end, a paper plate balanced on my knees. My daughter-in-law hovered nearby, loud enough for everyone to hear as she announced how hard it was keeping up with me these days. She said, "Poor thing, she forgets the simplest things. Last week she nearly left the stove on all night." Her voice was dripping with concern, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or offer sympathy. My son added fuel, shaking his head with a sigh. He said, "We're doing our best, but it's exhausting. You don't know what it's like unless you've lived it." The air turned thick. I felt every gaze sliding toward me, pity softening their faces. Pity, the mask people wear when they don't know the truth. I sat still, my fork hovering above the cake, forcing my hands not to tremble. Inside, I was burning. One neighbor leaned close and said kindly, "At least you have family to look after you." I wanted to scream, to tell them that family wasn't supposed to look at you like a possession waiting to be claimed. But I only smiled faintly and said, "Yes, I am fortunate." My voice was steady, calm, the way a blade feels cool before it cuts. The humiliation pressed on me like a weight, each whispered comment driving the nails deeper. I imagined my husband standing there, watching this circus, his jaw clenched the way it used to when someone disrespected me. I thought of my grandson's wide eyes when he asked if I forgot things. I thought of my roses outside the window, thorned and defiant. So I swallowed it, every jab, every smirk, every ounce of false concern. I swallowed it the way a soldier swallows pain on the battlefield, not because it doesn't hurt, but because the fight isn't over yet. When the cake was gone and the candles blown out, I excused myself early, letting them believe their little show had worn me down. But as I walked home, each step on the pavement felt like a vow. They could strip me of dignity in public, laugh at me in front of neighbors, paint me as feeble. None of it mattered, because the stage they were building was the same one I would use to reveal their betrayal. And when that day came, they would choke on the very pity they forced down my throat. After that birthday humiliation, something inside me hardened into stone. I stopped hoping they might come to their senses. People blinded by greed don't change, they only push harder. So I began preparing quietly, methodically, the way a soldier sharpens her blade long before battle. Every morning I returned to my notebook. I added details, times, places, phrases they thought would vanish into the air once spoken. I described the looks on their faces, the tone of their voices, the way my daughter-in-law tapped her manicured nails on that cursed folder. It wasn't just a record. It was my testimony, my shield against the storm I knew was coming. I also began moving small valuables, tucking them away in places they'd never think to look. My jewelry, the documents my husband and I signed decades ago, the photo albums that told the real story of this family. If they thought they could sweep through this house like scavengers, they would find empty drawers and locked cabinets. One afternoon, I walked slowly to the post office and mailed a sealed envelope to Mr. Harris's office. Inside was a letter in my own hand, explaining everything. The whispers, the documents, the pressure. If anything happened to me, he would know where to look and what to show. It gave me a strange peace, like placing a guard at the gate. But I didn't stop there. I began inviting neighbors over for coffee again, something I hadn't done in years. I let them see me strong, lucid, laughing, telling stories of the old days. I made sure they heard me speak clearly, remembered details, kept up with the news. If my son and his wife tried to paint me as a confused old woman, there would be witnesses to the truth. And then there was my grandson. I never told him everything, but I asked him to help me with small chores, carrying boxes, sorting through books. I let him see the real me, sharp and steady. I wanted him to remember, no matter what lies spread later, that his grandmother was not the fragile figure they described. Each night, I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. Not as a farewell, but as a reminder. This was mine, built with my husband's sweat and my sacrifice. They would not erase me from it. The day of reckoning was coming. I could feel it in the restless way my son's eyes darted, in the impatience behind his wife's smile. They were circling closer, certain I would break. But they didn't understand. I had already laid the foundation of my countermove. And soon they would find themselves standing on ground that wasn't theirs at all. They came with confidence this time, like generals marching onto a battlefield they believed already won. My son called ahead, his voice brisk, saying we'd go over the papers one last time. He didn't ask. He told me. By evening, they arrived, the folder clutched in his hand like a victory flag, my daughter-in-law trailing behind with her smile sharpened to a blade. The living room was set as though for a performance. They sat across from me, side by side, their shoulders squared. My son wasted no time. He opened the folder, smoothed the pages, and slid them toward me. "Mom, it's time." His voice carried the weight of finality, the certainty of a man who believed the end was written. I let my eyes linger on the papers. The lines blurred just slightly, though not from age, from the heat of rage simmering beneath my calm. I asked, "What happens if I don't sign?" My tone was mild, but my question dropped into the room like a stone into water. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my daughter-in-law leaned forward, her voice honeyed but tight. She said, "That would only make things more complicated. We're trying to protect you." The word protect again, dressed in silk but heavy with threat. My son added, "It'll be easier for everyone this way. You won't have to worry." His eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the pen he had already placed neatly on the table. I picked it up, turning it between my fingers. The silence stretched, and I could feel their impatience rising like smoke. I asked softly, "Do you remember what your father said when we paid off this house?" My son blinked, caught off guard. He said something about security, I think." I nodded. "He said this house would always be mine. Always." My voice was steady, the steel beneath velvet. Their faces tightened, the cracks in their composure showing. My daughter-in-law tried to recover, laughing lightly. "Oh, come on. We all know he wanted what's best for the family." I set the pen down carefully. "Then not today." The air snapped with tension. My son's jaw clenched, and I saw a flash of anger in his eyes, raw and unmasked. He muttered, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "No," I said quietly. "I'm making it exactly as hard as it should be." They stared at me, stunned by the calm, by the refusal they hadn't prepared for. They thought I would crumble, that my silence meant surrender. But what they didn't know was that the real will, the true one, was already written and sealed. And soon the curtain would rise. The day of revelation came not with thunder, but with paper. My son and his wife had finally grown bold enough to speak openly about their plans for the house. They talked of renovations, of how the yard would look once they tore up my rose bushes, of which rooms would be painted first. They didn't even lower their voices anymore. To them, the matter was settled. But I had been waiting for this moment. When the envelope arrived from Mr. Harris's office, I placed it neatly on the kitchen table. I called my son and asked him to stop by with his wife. My voice was gentle, almost inviting, and they came quickly, certain that victory was finally theirs. They walked in with smug smiles, their folder in hand. My daughter-in-law said brightly, "So, you're ready at last?" My son added, "This will make everything easier, Mom. We're glad you came around." I gestured toward the envelope. I said, "I wanted you to see something first." Their eyes lit up, no doubt expecting signed documents, proof that I had surrendered. My son tore the seal open, but the color drained from his face as he began to read. The will was there, signed, dated, notarized, every page a fortress. It left no room for manipulation, no opening for trickery. The house, the savings, everything I had built was protected exactly as I wanted, Safeguards locked it against their schemes. My lawyer's name stood at the bottom, ironclad. My daughter-in-law snatched the pages from his hands, scanning them with growing fury. Her face flushed, her voice rose. "What is this?" she demanded, her false sweetness gone, stripped bare. I met her gaze steadily. This is me, taking care of myself. My son's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked like a boy caught with stolen candy, shame and anger warring in his eyes. He muttered, "You don't trust us." "Trust?" I leaned forward, my voice sharp as a knife. "Trust is earned, not demanded. You wanted to strip me of everything your father and I worked for. You wanted to bury me before I was even gone." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of truth they could no longer deny. For once, they had no words. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, tucking it under my arm. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from triumph. They thought I was too old, too weak, too forgetful to understand. But I understood perfectly. I had outlived poverty, hardship, grief. Did they really think I couldn't outwit greed? As they left the house in silence, I walked to the window and looked out at the roses. Their thorns caught the fading light, sharp and unyielding. My husband's promise echoed in my mind. This house will always be yours. And now it truly was.